in the entire industry, and does it with a tremendous amount of consistency. And for that reason, I think Nintendo is almost exceedingly unique, as Dragon Chi puts it, is really unique and is the kind of vanguard of how companies can polish their game and still release it in a very complete way. Are there patches to Nintendo games? Yes, but Nintendo never releases a game without, I think, the old school mentality of, if you never are able to connect to the internet with this game in hand, it's still going to be playable, it's still going to be okay, and it's still going to work 100% for you. That's something I don't think other people have. And you know, you can make an argument that that limits Nintendo's capabilities or their audience, but at the same time, I think it endears them to their core audience, which is what keeps them consistently performative. However, it does limit their functionality in terms of being able to release on schedules that Microsoft or Sony would otherwise demand of their developers. And in that case, Nintendo does lose a little bit of their marketplace because of their ability to polish those games. But there's no question that if you're looking for polish and completeness of a game, look no further than Nintendo. Mr. K talked about the patching mentality as being a major killer in video gaming, and I certainly am. I'm certainly empathetic to that. Right? It is. I'm not saying I necessarily share that 100%, but I see how this patching mentality is a force that can help to kill gaming. I think it is a knee-jerk reaction to say that it's going to be the death of video gaming. I think it's a knee-jerk reaction to say that it's a force completely for ill. I think it's actually, I think you can make an argument that the patching mentality is what allows us to release a lot of games on time, and what allows us to have more or less complete experiences with minor and minute bug changes that need to be replaced. And I know that's not necessarily what Mr. K is talking about. He's talking about getting in the way of releasing. But I think, if I'm going to be honest, I think that games that are not quite ready for prime time, that get released as a means of, well, patching is just going to fix the game because it's not really complete yet, I think those games are actually very rare. I think most people release with the good enough mentality, and that games really get out there when they're ready, and the patches that come out are actually not fixing all that much in terms of the core mechanics. And another thing that was brought up by Mr. K that I thought was an interesting point is the idea of developers caring versus thinking a game is done. So maybe my question wasn't quite right. And Mr. K goes on to build implications of that. It really illustrates that they don't necessarily care whether a game is done. I think this is absolutely ridiculous. I think if I change the question to publishers versus developers, then I think Mr. K's got a 100% complete point here. This is built on, many of you build on this point later on, but I have never, and I've met a significant number of developers in my time. Developers are and you need to look no further than someone even like Kurt Schilling with 38 Studios to see that developers are not only wed to the experiences they create and the games they create, they see them as their children, and they are absolutely not motivated in any way, shape, or form to put them out there in any form other than perfection. Developers are driven by that mentality. Publishers are not. Publishers are very interested in releasing games that can help to develop the highest profit. And well, let's not say profit. That's a difficult thing to lock down, but can generate the most revenue in the quickest possible fashion, so that a profit can be realized and that a profit margin can be maintained on each unit that gets deployed, because that's very important for their future profitability moving forward, right? So again, getting into the market dynamics. So again, developers think that, this is why I asked the question, when a developer thinks a game is done, because a developer thinks of a game as their baby. It's very rare that you find a developer that wouldn't care. So I again respectively disagree with Mr. K in that regard, except that publishers not caring, which I think might be what Mr. K was trying to get at, is absolutely important. They don't care that a game is necessarily done, with the exception of if it gets out there that a game is not complete and isn't worth their time, they're going to be pretty pissed about that. And I couldn't agree more with Mr. K in that regard. So Pyros talked about the developer-publisher relationship, and this, I really kind of spoiled the thunder for this one, because this gets into exactly what I was talking about. You know, a developer and a publisher have a very complicated but symbiotic and necessary relationship. A lot of times you do have developers that are larger that will publish, that will self-publish. That's, you know, look at somebody like Activision Blizzard. They're now large enough to where, you know, you have one of the largest publishers also wed to one of the world's greatest developers, and that's why the whole merger makes sense. At the same time, Activision owns several developers, and they publish for people that are not in-house for them. So, you know, it becomes this kind of interesting, weird relationship. It's one of the reasons why I think Blizzard and Activision are now going to be looking to separate, because the values therein are not necessarily always the same. That's exactly gets to the point of what I was just talking about with Mr. K's comment. Developers have different goals than publishers, even though both of them are trying to make money. Let's not have a kindergarten understanding, folks, of business. Okay? We're better than that here on the Weekly Wringer, right? You guys are smarter than that. This is, to say that something is all about money does not at all speak to the detriment of the development process or gaming or publishing in that regard. What it does is it means that something that is big business is going to have to process through different mechanisms than perhaps other games. Minecraft is subject to a different economy of scale and a different economy in general by virtue of the development process that produces it. Look at something like Diablo 3. Could that be compared to something like Minecraft and its development cycle? Of course not. It's completely different. And the nature of publishers and the nature of developers speaks to the difference in how those published and how those developed games get released to the public. And as a result, that complicated nature is not only what creates the greatest video games of all time that we all know and love, it is also what produces a lot of the crap that we hate, loathe, and don't enjoy, and wish would go away. So, maybe the question should be, do we tolerate the patching mentality? Do we tolerate the mediocrity that this model produces in order to see the great examples shining on the top of a hill, the half-lives, if you will, and the Nintendo, the Nintendo experiences that really show us how games can be released well. In other words, guys, what I'm really saying, and maybe I'm tipping my hand a little bit too much here, is to say maybe what we're really talking about here is that we tolerate a certain amount of it in order to be able to really have those polished. And really what we're talking about here is a necessary evil of the internet age. A question for you all to think about. The Male White Mage brought up the idea of Minecraft as being as an experience as an example of an experience that is never really complete. What does this mean? It means that the game is never really done. Minecraft is never produced as a originally. It changes, it shifts gears, but it is never released initially as a means of completing an experience. So being completely done as a game from top to bottom. In other words, it's meant as a crowdsourced, continuously bug-tested, continuously, I guess, put through the ringer in terms of its capabilities in order to continually improve on the experience and completely revamp the gameplay. And the core mechanics have decidedly remained unchanged by virtue of the game being fairly similar, but the game itself, in terms of a game experience from top to bottom, has very much changed since Minecraft was put out. And that crowdsourcing that went behind it, as I say, is separate and different from most games that get produced. But it begs the question, how many games could actually go through that kind of a process, and does that fundamentally change it? Guys, do you get the sense here that we're talking about things that most video game websites aren't talking about? That is an absolute By the way, and I only bring this up because it's very important for me, and it's very important for Clan of the Grey Wolf. You guys as a community escalate the conversation to this level, and that's why we're here, and I just want to say thank you at this point. If you guys are watching this video, any of you that have never seen a Clan of the Grey Wolf video before, you're watching this, you're saying, holy shit, these guys have their stuff together, right? We're having a conversation here that most video game websites are frankly incapable of having, and I absolutely rest the responsibility of that with you guys, so thank you all very much. Anyway, moving forward, a couple of new commenters for us this week. Nemesis Enforcer. Welcome to the community. Thanks for the comment. Games are never truly complete, according to Nemesis Enforcer. In other words, games are kind of like, so, and I hate to, this was not a games as art suggestion by Nemesis Enforcer, but he says games are never truly complete. Correct, I get that, but I think there's an implication there about games as art. Because art, in and of itself, is produced and is pursued by most because it is never a complete process. A work of art is never truly finished, as it were. And as a result, video games as an artistic medium are probably never quite finished either. This means, for Nemesis Enforcer, that patching is a healthy part of the process. That retouching is something that should happen over time in order to make a game complete or up to date or as good as it can be in a current age. And I think that's a really insightful comment. I think it also, though, complicates my notion of what George Lucas does with the Star Wars movies. So maybe I don't want to go too far down this road with Nemesis Enforcer, but I absolutely think that all of us are okay with the idea of patching, and that a game is never truly complete because there's always going to be some kind of measure of bug, but we still have a problem with games getting released that shouldn't be released, and I don't think any of us would deny that. Sir Sweeps, another new commenter this week, talked about, people pay for a service and they expect to use it. If you buy Diablo 3 and you now realize that in order to use Diablo 3 you have signed up for Battle.net and you have to be online in order to play this game, that's fine, I think, as long as, I don't think anybody has a problem with that, except for the fact that they've paid for it now, they expect it to be live. And the problem that people had with Diablo 3 early on was not that the game was broken, it was not even that it had DLC that might have been, draconic or limiting. It's that if I pay for this and I bring it home and I pop it into my machine, it needs to work. And a lot of people did not get that. That is a completely different concept. That means that Diablo was not ready from an infrastructure perspective for the deluge of people that were going to use it. Some of you made allusions to DDoS attacks. That's exactly what it's like. It's basically you release this new thing and the demand that you see that actually purchases the game that you've been planning for months and months and months, you're not prepared for. And that's a different story altogether. One I think that we could easily do an entirely another weekly Wringer about. How does a company decide when they can actually support the game that they're going to make? Just look at 38 Studios. They spent a ton of money in terms of supporting their game from servers and so on and so forth, to be able to produce these games. Well, things didn't pan out the way that they wanted to with the Shadows of Amalur? Kingdoms of Amalur, I apologize, series, and as a result, they didn't get the payout they needed to support the other game, and Project Copernicus, and as a result, you end up with a model that crashes and burns. So the infrastructure is exceedingly important as well, and I think to ignore that would be to ignore the current status of video game production in the 21st century as well. Akira VGA talks about the patch, the concept of the patch. Because as Akira VGA is one to do, Andrew from Video Game Auctions, by the way, you should check out videogameauctions.com. His point is that the idea of the patch only makes sense in a contemporary games context. So if you look back at retro games, it's almost that these things are not commensurate, right? So, in other words, In other words, just like I just compared Minecraft to Diablo 3, you can compare a Nintendo cartridge to Diablo 3 as completely different process.